Hey class, here we are, back again discussing, this time, Aphra Behn and her poem, The Disappointment. All right, we have another writer. There's her picture. Okay, that's a portrait, a painting of her, of Aphra Behn. So maybe she sat for that and that's what she looks like. We have to presume that, right? Yes, so there she is. What strikes me about the paintings, they wear very low cut dresses, and that's probably presumably a rebuttal to the more conservative dress styles of the puritanical Commonwealth that had just preceded this time period. We have several web links here that if you want to learn more about her, including some YouTube clips. Some scenes from one of Aphra Behn's many popular plays. So remember, I told you the theaters were reopened, so thank heavens she could write plays for the theater now, and she wrote some that became very popular. The Rover is one. Here's an excerpt from a one-woman show that dramatizes Aphra Behn's poetry, so that's a little fun. And this YouTube video is a biographical clip about Aphra Behn's life and writings. So, anyway, just fun stuff to check out in the lecture, the written lecture, that is. Aphra Behn lived from about 1640 to 1689, so to about 49 years of age. Her early childhood would have been spent during the Commonwealth. As you know, that went from like 1640, well, early youth prior to the Commonwealth, and then when about 1649, of course, they started fighting in like about 1642, but then Charles the First was beheaded in 1649. The Commonwealth went to about 1660, and then you had that Restoration, which reopened the theaters, and then women were finally allowed to perform on stage again. That happened in about 1660, 1661. So that would have been when she just kind of reached adulthood at that point, about 20 or 21. And she lived to about 49 years of age. Now, about Behn, Virginia Woolf wrote, now remember Virginia Woolf, she wrote A Room of One's Own when we read her during the first week of class. So now, this is something that Virginia Woolf, who wrote hundreds of years later about Aphra Behn. She said, quote, all women together ought to let flowers fall upon the tomb of Aphra Behn, for it was she who earned them the right to speak their minds, unquote. Why, you may ask? Well, among many reasons. Aphra was the first professional woman writer in England. Yes, yes. We knew Christina Pizan wrote professionally, but she was not an English-speaking woman. She did not live in England. So Aphra Behn was the very first English-speaking woman living in England to be able to have a profession as a writer. She supported herself through her writing. Also, she was the only female dramatist for the first 20 years of her career in England. Second only to John Dryden, she was the most prolific English dramatist of her time. So number one, most prolific dramatist, in other words, the most popular, who wrote the most, was John Dryden. But number two, Aphra Behn, a woman. So we really see why Virginia Woolf wrote that novel about Orlando, kind of encompassing how women were treated in society in the form of this character of Orlando, who starts off as male and then shifts in the 1600s to a female. And it coincides with Aphra Behn's rise to importance and influence as a female writer in England. Furthermore, Aphra Behn actually worked as a spy in Antwerp, the Netherlands. Can you believe that? She worked as a spy for King Charles II of England. Remember, he was the king that had been restored to the throne after the Commonwealth. So yeah, she worked for him as a spy in the Netherlands. Let's just say that this was certainly not a typical profession for women of the day. In fact, no profession for women was more typical of the day, right? Conflict between the British and the Dutch had broken out. So Aphra worked in the Netherlands under the code name Astrea, the pseudonym under which she later wrote many literary works. So even though she's a female writer, we're still having pseudonyms going on here. All right. So there may have been some taboo, maybe. Of course it was taboo, but that may have been incentive for her to use a pseudonym. Anyway, she used that pseudonym as a spy too. Aphra became the lover of a royal, so gained his confidence to obtain secrets that would advantage the British in the conflict against the Dutch. So that would have been a Dutch royal. Aphra's early adventures as a spy and as a child living in Suriname with her father. Kind of interesting. She lived in Suriname. Suriname is a country in South America. It's on the eastern coast of South America. She actually lived there as a child with her father, the lieutenant governor, and that perhaps contributed to her seeming fascination with sex and politics, as evidenced by their recurrence in her works. Now, the work we read for this class this week, The Disappointment, that's a poem she wrote in 1680. That poem examines the sexual dynamic of a brief encounter between a man and a woman, Lysander and Chloris. Also evidenced in this poem is the sexual freedom with which Aphra Behn surprisingly and unabashedly wrote. Very surprising and for the time period that she wrote unabashedly about it. Unabashedly just means unashamedly. She just wrote very, here it is, guys. The fact that it was during this time period and that she was a woman writing about it were both very surprising factors that she wrote unashamedly or unabashedly about it. But it was also the hallmark of the Restoration Court of Charles II because it's much more permissive and indulgent. But a trait still considered by many scandalous in a woman, writer or not. Aphra Behn seemed almost entirely immune to the social pressures facing other women writers at the time. So there were these social pressures that kind of pushed women writers out of the forefront, but Aphra Behn still seemed to survive them for whatever reason. Although Aphra did write works under a pseudonym, again, a shield to some extent behind which women could hide from a censoring public. She did write. It seemed like her mind, right? Or at least part of her mind, right? She wrote about some pretty interesting themes. And as you read in The Disappointment this week, the poem that she wrote, yeah, it's kind of unabashed, right? It's like a sexual encounter between Lysander and Chloris. And it doesn't go the way the norms went at the time, right? Not that people didn't have sex during that time. Of course they did, because here we are, the human race, still carrying on till now. But this encounter is certainly not what would have been accepted in polite society at the time. Maybe that's why she said it in Greek times, right? Lysander and Chloris are Greek names and Greek figures, and it's written very much like a pastoral poem, the form of the time period, but very different because it kind of turns the tables on the sexual dynamics between Lysander and Chloris, and you'll see that as you read the poem. So enjoy The Disappointment by Aphra Behn, and enjoy Aphra Behn. Her life is indeed fascinating. Thank you.